Hello, I'm Robert Horton. I'm a member of the National Society of Film Critics and a board member at the nonprofit Scarecrow Video in Seattle. 2020 has brought us the second year of Scarecrow Academy, which began as a screening discussion series at Scarecrow and which became an online series after the pandemic began. In case it isn't clear from my hair, I am speaking to you from the middle of a pandemic. Our subject this year has been the art in horror, Horror and the Director, which looks at the horror movie through the perspective of what a film director does. And we are wrapping up our semester with our final film. The last session will take place on Saturday, November 28th at 2 p.m. Pacific time. You can register for this free Zoom meeting by clicking on the links at the Scarecrow Academy page on Scarecrow's website, or if you're watching this on YouTube, you can look below me and find some links there. We began this series earlier this year in February with a film from 1922, F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu. We are finishing almost 100 years later with a film from 2018, Hereditary, written and directed by Ari Aster. In this video, I will introduce the film and suggest some things that we might talk about during our Zoom discussion. Ari Aster is an American filmmaker who was born in 1986, partly raised in New York City, partly raised in New Mexico. This film is set in the Southwest, by the way. He attended the American Film Institute, made a couple of short films that got some attention, and made his feature debut with this film, Hereditary. It was shot on a relatively low budget, although it has some very top-level actors. The film debuted at the Sundance Film Festival at a midnight screening, and it teaches us something, I think, about ideas of movie reception and expectation. Came into Sundance, mostly unheralded film by a first-time feature director. The critics went nuts over it at Sundance. Over the next few months, there was some buzz that was building because of that, and when the film finally opened, there's this polling service called CinemaScore that has, for years, has been polling audience members when they come out of a movie on its opening weekend. And the score on the opening weekend of Hereditary for the film was a D+. That is D for dog. That is not good. Which must be in part, I think, because the audience had been led to expect the scariest movie of the year from some of the early reception of it, but also I think audiences had gotten conditioned to certain expectations of the horror movie in 2018, and Hereditary, although it does hit virtually all of the horror movie buttons along the way, also goes against expectations. Nevertheless, the film was a big box office success. The director went on to make Midsommar, a remarkable outdoorsy, sunlit folk horror movie that was released in 2019. We'll talk about the directing style of Hereditary, which is very formal, very rigorous. In the film, Toni Collette, who plays the mother of this family, she gives a gigantic performance in this film. She plays an artist who creates these miniature dioramas of her own home life. And I think the director, Ari Aster, encourages us to draw comparisons with what she does and the meticulousness of it and everything to the film's own very careful, very composed style, all of which still contains the grisliest kind of horror movie imagery. I wonder if the film's formal style is the equivalent of the family's history of careful behavior, in which some kind of essential terror or trauma is covered over with good manners, with an acquiescence to a shared bond of silence. That mode cannot sustain itself, of course, and so the movie, like the family, eventually comes apart in various over-the-top ways. Ari Aster has said, "I wanted to make a film that served as a serious meditation on grief and trauma. It begins as a family tragedy and then continues down that path, but gradually curdles into a full-born nightmare, in the same way that life can really feel like a nightmare, like everything is falling apart." So in our discussions, we've sometimes talked about the way that movies, like other narrative art, can provide a kind of key for how to experience them, how to watch them in a movie, a line of dialogue or an image. And the design of the miniature models in Hereditary, I think, does some of that, but I think the title itself is meant to be a key that unlocks the film. The story begins with the death of a grandmother, and it becomes clear that some kind of illness or other unholy element has been passed on through the generations. This turns out to be important not just in connecting the various plot points when you get to the end, but also to explaining, I think, just what is going on in the final section of the movie, which is pretty wild, and which I think is the part of the film that audiences really rebelled against. Certainly the audience that I saw it with rebelled against it at that point. This is one of those horror movies where we shouldn't be entirely sure whether what we're seeing is some sort of reality or the subjective experience of one or more of the characters. When Toni Collette's character creates a little, one of her dioramas of this horrible accident scene, which we've seen play out earlier in the film, much to the disgust of her husband, played by Gabriel Byrne, she excuses the morbid gesture by saying, in a sort of wonderfully academic way, it's a neutral view of the accident. But is anything in Hereditary neutral, even when the film seems to be presenting this clinically detached perspective on its family melodrama? And for all that, we will also consider Astor's periodic focus on the human face, which remains an important field of action in this movie, regardless of the kind of circus of horror movie madness that's going on elsewhere. Here, I think Astor follows in the footsteps of one of his avowed influences, Ingmar Bergman, whose presence is felt in this film, except, maybe for all the decapitations. We'll talk about these questions and perhaps the film's evocative music/soundscape, and definitely that gonzo ending. We hope you will join us November 28th to talk about this very intense film as we round off our 2020 series, The Art in Horror. See you then.